Hello, my name is Mohammed Kimji. What is the Bible? I just want to say a few words in introduction to the Bible and to the Gospels of the New Testament, in particular the Gospel of Matthew, which I will be referring to in my upcoming videos on the Bible. The word Bible actually comes from the Koine Greek. Koine Greek is the Greek of the first century of the Common Era. It comes from the Koine Greek ta biblia, which means the books. That's right. The Bible is a collection of books. What kind of books? Bible refers either to the Christian Bible or to the Hebrew Bible. And in the Christian tradition, the Hebrew Bible is understood as one part of the Christian Bible. It is called the Old Testament. The Christian Bible has two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament consists of the books that constitute the Hebrew Bible, although in the Christian tradition, they're placed in a different order than in the Hebrew Bible. The designation Old Testament, again, is a Christian designation. It implies that the Hebrew Bible, or alternatively the Jewish Bible, has been superseded by a New Testament, which the Jews do not accept. And for the Jews and in the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew Bible is original, complete, and has not been superseded. Let me say a few words about the Hebrew Bible then. The books in the Hebrew Bible were written in Hebrew in the geographic area of modern day Israel. The Hebrew Bible is actually much, much older than the New Testament writings. The bulk of the Hebrew Bible is believed to have been produced between the 10th and the 6th centuries before the Common Era. So we're looking about 1000 to 501 BCE. It would have originally been copied by scribes on natural perishable materials like papyrus or leather or wooden tablets. However, little is known archaeologically about the exact material used because no Hebrew manuscripts have survived beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest of which date to about the 3rd century BCE. The writings of the New Testament were written much later, likely between 50 to 95 of the Common Era. So within the span of about 50 years, but scholars disagree sometimes on the dates. The Hebrew Bible contains 3 parts. The first part is the Torah, which is the teaching and the instructions of Moses. It constitutes the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, together known as the 5 books of Moses. Now, this is what I will refer to generally as the law when I speak about the law in the Gospel of Matthew. The second part of the Hebrew Bible is the prophets. The prophets could refer to the major prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, or the minor prophets like Amos and Hosea. Prophets refer to the books of the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures. And the last part of the Hebrew scriptures refer to other writings. And this includes poetry and other writings that together is called by scholars under the general title wisdom literature. Now, you will ask, who wrote the Bible? Now, again, the Bible is a collection of books. And in fact, the authorship of the different writings in the Hebrew Bible is unknown. Different people, or it could be groups of people, wrote and edited different parts during different times. These different parts were organized to form a unified whole, probably by the end of the 1st or the 2nd century of the Common Era. Scholarly textual analysis has revealed different strands at certain points in the Hebrew Bible that might at first appear to come from the same source, but which, when examined, have likely been written in different centuries. You will ask, well, how have scholars done this? Imagine doing a kind of forensic analysis of the style and the vocabulary and the tempo and so on. And you will see that if I was to write something, and if you were to write something, and if one of your friends was to write something, and if my father was to write something, and we took all of these different writings and we glued it all together or stitched it all together or typed it all together, you would be able to notice that this writing is different from that writing because the vocabulary has changed and the style has changed and the tempo has changed and maybe the ideas have changed. The way in which we speak has changed. And so what biblical scholars have found is that there are moments where, although the editors have taken writings and put them all together, they actually they actually have different authors, and the different parts of what was put together was likely written in different times, maybe even different centuries. So at these particular points, what appears to be a unified and seamless story that was written by one author may actually have had many different authors, many different groups of writers, many different editors, many different groups of editors, who, again, could have lived hundreds of years apart. Close textual analysis reveals many different fingerprints from many different sources with many different styles and vocabularies. So really the question of authorship, particularly where different strands interweave, is complex and largely unresolved among biblical scholars. The New Testament. So the New Testament writings, which constitute the second part of the Christian Bible concerning the life and the teachings of Jesus, that's what the New Testament concerns, the life and the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was not a Christian. There were no Christians in Jesus's time. The idea of Christianity originated much, much later after Jesus died. Jesus was a Jew, and he was living under Roman occupation during the early Roman Empire. The Roman Empire began in the year 27 BCE, and the first Roman emperor was Augustus Caesar. And that's the emperor under whom Jesus lived at the first part of his life. He lived under the reign of the Emperor Augustus Caesar. In the later part of his life, he lived under the reign of the second Roman emperor, Tiberius Caesar, who was Augustus's adopted son. Augustus literally means the great one or the revered one, the majestic one, and he was given that title in the year 27 BCE, which was the very first year of his reign. And Augustus's reign ended in the year 14 CE. At that point, the reign of the second emperor of Rome, Tiberius Caesar, began. So there are references to Caesar in the Gospels, and you might anticipate that when Caesar is mentioned, it likely refers to Tiberius Caesar, if Tiberius Caesar was the emperor during the second part of Jesus' life. Jesus actually was believed to have been born between the year 7 and 4 BCE. And he was crucified likely in the 30s CE. So if he was more than 20 years old, then we're looking at Jesus living under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius ruled from the years 14 CE to the years 14 to 37 CE. You will have heard, in all likelihood, the names of other Roman emperors. After Augustus Caesar and Tiberius Caesar, we had the reign of Caligula. Then we had the reign of, well, Caligula was the adopted son of Tiberius, and he ruled from the years 37 to 41 CE. And the fourth emperor of Rome was Claudius. He was the uncle of Tiberius, and he ruled from the years 41 to 54 CE. And then we had the reign of Nero, the adopted son of Claudius, who ruled from the years 54 to 68 CE. So the first five emperors of Rome, again, Augustus Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And all came really from two families, the family of Julius Caesar and the family of Claudius. Who was Julius Caesar? Julius Caesar was Augustus's adoptive father or great uncle. So all the first five emperors came from two families, Julius Caesar and Claudius, and for this reason they're referred to as the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Now, there was no such thing again as Christianity during Jesus's life. There were no Christians. There was no Christian Bible. There was no Old Testament. There was no New Testament. And there were no Gospels during Jesus's life. The idea of Christianity simply did not exist. It developed only after Jesus died. And even after Jesus died, Christianity was not an organized religion as you see it today. What Jesus did do very carefully was study the Hebrew scriptures. In the Gospel of Luke, there is, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, Jesus is described as sitting with his teachers, and he is just listening and asking questions, much like you and I would do. Jesus knew the Hebrew scriptures, and he knew them very, very, very well. In fact, they are the only scriptures that Jesus would have known. We know the Hebrew scriptures were written in Hebrew. What language did Jesus speak? Jesus spoke Aramaic, and Aramaic is a language closely related to Hebrew. He does make reference to the Hebrew scriptures frequently in the Gospels, and so do the writers of the Gospels themselves. It should be noted, however, that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and he lived in Aramaic-speaking communities. And while this is the case, the vast majority of the citations from the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, Koine Greek, are taken from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Greek translation is called the Septuagint. So it's really interesting because when you're reading the Gospels, you see that Jesus is speaking in the text. It's in Greek. Jesus himself spoke Aramaic, but he read, understood Hebrew very, very well. How much Greek Jesus knew, it's not entirely clear. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is said to have been born under the reign of King Herod. You will see this in chapter 2 of Matthew, verses 1 to 3. The title King Herod refers to Herod the Great, who was appointed the client king of Judea from the years 37 to 4 before the Common Era. And we are told in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus lived under the reign of King Herod. He was born under the reign of King Herod, but Herod died. We know that Herod died in the year 4 BCE. So if Jesus was born under the reign of King Herod, and in the Gospel we see that Herod died, well, fairly soon after Jesus was born, then scholars estimate that Jesus was likely born between the years 7 and 4 BCE. He couldn't have really been born any later than 4 BCE if Herod died in 4 and Jesus' birth was under the reign of Herod. Biblical scholars have suggested then that Jesus was born likely between the years 7 and 4 BCE. And it's, again, consistent with what we find in the Gospel. Now, I mentioned that one of the languages spoken in the early Roman Empire was Greek, Koine Greek. And this actually was the language that was spoken in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Latin was the other language spoken, but it was spoken by the officials, those in charge of legislation. It was spoken in the military. It was really spoken to the powerful and educated classes. It was the official language. Latin was the official language of imperial rule. Jesus would not have known Latin, and he, generally speaking, would not have spoken Greek. Again, it's not clear how much Greek Jesus would have known. Now, biblical scholars believe that the Gospels were not written until about 40 to 60 years after Jesus died, maybe 30 to 70 years, say, after Jesus died. The Gospels then are not to be taken as eyewitness accounts of Jesus's life. It's not as though people were writing about Jesus while they were following him around when he was alive. The Gospel of Matthew is the most, I think, comprehensive of all the Gospels. And it was probably written during 80s, maybe later 70s to 80s of the Common Era, approximately about 50 years after Jesus died, but maybe 40 years after Jesus died. And we don't know who the author is. We don't know how many authors there were. Authorship is a mystery. Now, I mentioned that Jesus was born likely between 7 and 4 before the Common Era, and he died, he was crucified likely between 30 and 35 of the Common Era, which would have made him about 40 years old when he was crucified. There's no exact date of his birth or crucifixion. He grew up around the area of Palestine in modern day Israel. And at the time, the region was under the Roman Empire and under Roman control. The height of the Roman Empire was 117 CE. And at that time, the Romans had really conquered all of the land in southern Europe, in the western part of the Middle East, in the northern part of Africa. And the Mediterranean Sea was called Mare Nostrum. It was our sea by the Romans. Some 5 million square kilometers was under Roman control. The gospel. What does gospel mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word euangelion, which is a word translated as good news in English. So we are reading the good news. We are reading something celebratory. We are reading something that is a happy occasion. This word actually was used during the time of Augustus. Now, let me just mention something about Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. He was considered the son of God. He considered himself the son of God, and the Romans considered him son of God, because his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, was considered a god. Actually, Julius Caesar was considered to have been deified. He was considered to have been made into a god in the year 44 BCE, before the Common Era, at his funeral games. So Julius Caesar was assassinated, and at his funeral games, the Romans saw a comet in the sky, and the comet was there for 7 days. It's probably the most famous comet in history. And Augustus said, "That's the soul of my father." And the Romans believed it. The Romans believed that the adoptive father of Augustus Caesar had been deified, had been made into a god, had been made into a deity. In 44 BCE, Augustus wasn't called Augustus. Augustus received that name in the year 27 BCE after he won a very, very major battle, sea battle, called the Battle of Actium. But in 44 BC, he was called Octavian. And when Julius Caesar was understood to have been deified, that reflected directly on his adopted son, Octavian, who considered himself to have been then the son of God. And there are, interestingly, many inscriptions that we find in the ancient world referring to Augustus as the son of God, as the son of the deified Julius Caesar. And the good news, or coming from the Greek word euangelion, that word euangelion was used for happy announcements. It referred to the celebratory announcements, such as like the military victory or the birth of a son or a wedding. And in fact, an inscription from the year 9 before the Common Era uses a variant of this word to refer to the birth of Augustus as the divine savior. So the first emperor of Rome, again, was considered son of God. And in the New Testament, the word euangelion refers either to the act of preaching the good news, or it refers to the good news that Jesus preached. And what is the good news? That is a question, I think, that is really very, very critical to ask as you read and study the Gospels. I mentioned that the Hebrew scriptures are divided into 3 parts: the law or Torah, the books of the prophets, and wisdom literature. The books of the New Testament, which is actually much smaller than the Hebrew scriptures, are the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark is the earliest of the 4 Gospels. John is the latest of the 4 Gospels. That's one part of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels. We also have the letters of Paul, and Paul is, you can say, the second founder of Christianity, who spread the good news or the Gospels of Jesus on several missionary journeys in the Mediterranean world. And we also have other writings and letters. Now, it's believed that the anonymous author of the Gospel of Matthew borrowed and extensively revised material from the Gospel of Mark, which again is the earliest of the Gospels, probably written around 60 CE, but nobody knows for sure. And not only did the writer or writers of Matthew borrow and revise material from the Gospel of Mark, but he also used other sources, including oral traditions that were circulating at the time. And I mentioned that of the 4 Gospels, Matthew offers the most comprehensive account of Jesus's teaching, and that's why that's going to be the focus of the following talks that I give about the Bible. And by Bible, I'm using a general term referring to the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, mainly with a focus on the 4 Gospels, and mainly on the focus actually on one of the 4 Gospels, but I may make reference to other parts in different moments. When passages are cited from the Hebrew Bible, when you are reading, you will see that they're cited according to chapters and verses. Chapters are usually signified by a number in bold and in large font, and verses are either immediately beside the chapter number. For example, 1:3 refers to chapter 1, verse 3, or they may be in superscript, small numbers. So you will be able to follow along if you are interested. I think that is all I want to say for now. I hope that you enjoy and learn from and find meaningful the following talks. If you are interested, I'm not one to keep track of how many views I have. I'm just focused on producing something that has value. And for me, there is very little that has more value than this. My name is Mohammed Kimji. Please, if you need to get in touch with me or want to get in touch with me or want to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you for your time.